Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure today to be joined by someone who truly needs no introduction, but I will make a very brief introduction. I'm joined today by Professor Amy Edmondson, a superstar in organizational psychology and leadership research, and of course, the founder and inventor of the notion of psychological safety. And we're going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite books today, The Fearless Organization, and some articles that I had the pleasure of co-writing with Amy. So Amy, how are you today?
I'm well. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. And it actually isn't the case that I invented the term. The term was in the literature earlier. Ed Schein and Warren Bennett had talked about it in the 60s, if you can believe it. I'm the first to study it at the group level and really show it is a group level construct. So we'll take it from there. But I wanted to correct the record.
That's very good. I'm happy to be corrected. I feel the safety to make mistakes and I'll continue making them. And I think in your book, one of the quotes that I highlighted for today, it says, you can tell whether a man, or shall we say a person, is clever by their answers. You can tell whether a person is wise by their questions. So I'm obviously stupid already starting with a bad question.
No.
Yeah, but
No,
I would
you're
say that's a little bit like saying Steve Jobs didn't invent the smartphone. It was invented by someone else before. I mean, you really kind of took the significance of the concept and the term to a different level. And that's probably the first question I have. You know, what do you think are the factors or the forces that are responsible for the unstoppable popularity of the term, of the notion?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I I think it's a number of things that have come together in just the right way. And the catalyst, I think, for this renewed interest in the growing popularity of the term was Google's study, Google's Project Aristotle, which was written about and then widely read about in the New York Times Magazine. And the short version of it is that they studied for several years with lots of data, lots of analytic prowess, the question of how do you explain performance differences across teams, right? A pretty old question and an important question. And especially in a workplace where people are very talented, very highly selected. And what they found, to their then surprise, was that the factor, the variable that explained most of the variance was psychological safety, right? So that then sort of generated lots of interest, obviously. But I think what's kept it going and what explains the kind of continued attention is, I'll put it simply, the mess we're in, right? The growing recognition that in fact we live in a complex, uncertain, volatile, ambiguous world, right? So when you're in an environment where your line of sight just is short and you can't predict the future with certainty, then you're going to be in a world where there's going to be a need for more interpersonal risk-taking. And psychological safety is about a kind of environment where you believe interpersonal risks are okay to take.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think the kind of aspirational or theoretical love that more and more leaders and organizations, including HR, seem to display or demonstrate for psychological safety has actually crystallized sufficiently to actual practices that enable people, to speak up fearlessly, be themselves, and, not be worried about the repercussions of what they do or say?
Mostly no. And
Okay.
that isn't for lack of trying, right? That is not to cast aspersions on professionals in these fields, right? That is to basically come back to and underline the fundamental psychology here, which is that this is hard, right? Interpersonal risk-taking in a social system, especially a hierarchical one, and frankly, they're all hierarchical, is just unnatural, right? We don't do it. It's so much easier and natural to hold back, like to wait and see, to test the waters, to, it's the old saying, nobody ever got fired for silence is arguably true, right? So you don't, it's always going to be both safer and easier to kind of hold back and, wait and see rather than to take an interpersonal risk. So I think until the recognition of just how hard and unusual this is sinks in, the practices aren't enough to make it happen, routinely.
Mhm, mhm. Let me just pause or take a little kind of parenthesis for viewers who aren't familiar with the concept. Before I'll ask you to define it simply, I just want to go over the 7 indicators that you have in your book, which are kind of a really useful and quick self-assessment guide to see whether the teams, organizations, or cultures that people inhabit actually provide them with safety. So 1, if you make a mistake on this team, it is often held against you. 2, members of this team are able to bring up problems and tough issues. 3, people on this team sometimes reject others for being different. 4, it is safe to take a risk on this team. 5, it is difficult to ask other members of this team for help. 6, no one on this team would deliberately act in a way that undermines my efforts. 7, working with members of this team, my unique skills and talents, that's probably my favorite item, are valued and utilized. And of course, some of these are reversed, but if I just pause and look at this number 7, working with the members of this team or organization, my unique skills and talents are valued and utilized. It seems to me we still live in a world where most employees, it's not even that they're not valued, they're not understood for what they could contribute and thrive. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. So first of all, those, as you mentioned, those are metrics. Those are survey items. And yes, slightly fewer than half are reverse scored. You want people to score low on those. But yeah, I do think, and I think it is the case that most employees are not in organizations where either they feel or truly their unique skills are valued, right, and put to good use. And I suspect that's a remnant of industrial era management models. Some of them explicit, and some of them just mental models, right, that shape how we think. So we think rather simplistically when we're not really paying much attention about management, which is, well, people should just do their job and hit their KPIs without taking into consideration that most people are doing things that aren't, really simple in terms of cause effect. It isn't the case that if you just buckle down and work hard, you'll absolutely get the result you want, whether that's closing a major account, in sales, or inventing a new product, or even just solving a client relationship issue, right? These are sort of very complex things that are solved by ingenuity and responsiveness and listening, not by sheer dogged, instruction following.
So remind us how you define psychological safety.
As a belief that the context is safe for interpersonal risks, like speaking up with mistakes, questions, concerns, dissenting views. And perhaps a shorter way to say that is permission for candor, right? That in this group, and that doesn't mean it's easy. It just means I believe that's what we're supposed to do around here. I'm supposed to speak up.
What is you obviously spoke about this all over the world, and we know that some cultures are more hierarchical than others, right? So how do you persuade people in very hierarchical top-down cultures at the national level, not organization, that there is a benefit to kind of crowdsource the knowledge, distributed knowledge of teams, etc.? Does it still appeal, or is it a little bit controversial?
I always get that pushback. Yeah, but what about, right? And then, country name here that is seen as greater power distance, more hierarchical. And, it's the short answer is yes, and the need is just as great. right? So maybe the hurdles are going to be higher for trying to create that kind of work environment, but the need for customer responsiveness, innovation, problem solving, reporting of mistakes is just as great, right? They have just as many competitive pressures on their businesses as businesses in the West do. So it's not optional. You can't just say, well, this isn't congruent with our culture, so we'll just sort of skip that chapter. It's like, well, yeah, but if you want to be really good, you got to take this seriously. Or I guess, you have to design your work processes so that, they're, any idiot could do it, but who wants to do that, right? Nobody really wants to. I mean, we do automate things that can be automated, and that's great, because that can be mind-numbing kinds of tasks. So we can point to companies that are in cultures where power distance is high, hierarchy is great, but because of the recognition that they needed and wanted, desperately to be a learning organization, they put in place systems and mindsets that made this possible. Famously, Toyota, the Toyota production system is entirely based on the idea that any team member at any level can see a slight or even potential slight imperfection and speak up about it immediately. To make that easier, they've famously put in an end-on cord, which you just pull the cord. And that alerts, a team leader to the possibility that something might be amiss, right? And so countercultural in Japan to do things like that. But at Toyota, they'll do it because they've bought into, this is how we become and stay great, right? By continuous learning, by continuous detection and correction of process problems.
That's super interesting. And I was thinking about the reverse as well, right? So what you're saying is that even in hierarchical, top-down, high power distance cultures, you can see the benefits of psychological safety. Right. And I was thinking about the reverse. Just because you're in an informal, flat, non-hierarchical culture doesn't mean employees are not going to want to lie to their bosses, and CEOs are not going to be deceived by others because they know that there's a benefit to sucking up to them.
Yeah, I mean, bad news famously doesn't travel up very well.
Yeah,
and that is true in flat power distance countries as well as in steep ones. Bob Sutton at Stanford says that bosses live in a fool's paradise, right? Which is, they live in a world where by and large things are going well, aren't they? Yes, boss, right? And it's a very clever and hardworking organization that figures out a way to make that not the case.
So let's talk about, some of the things that you think are sort of practical ways to help managers actually create cultures of safety and instill safety in their teams. Do you have any suggestions or tips that come to mind?
Yeah, I tend to think of it, maybe it's my old engineering training, but as sort of before, during, and after. And that's oversimplified because it's really all during, all action is in the arena. But the before really refers to things you can do in an ongoing way to set the stage for people comprehending that this way of working matters. Matters to them, matters to the organization, matters to customers. And that's a combination. What do you need to do to make people believe it matters, that, that what they have to say, even though it might feel risky to say it when, you're not quite sure it will be well received, that it's worth doing anyway? Well, I think it's really two things. One is an emphasis, and this is old news, but an emphasis on the purpose, like on why it matters, on why our customers or our patients or our communities really depend upon us, and that makes me feel as an employee just a little bit more motivated and a little bit more important, like that what I do plays a role here that impacts that, something we care about. And then the other, which is more specific to psychological safety, is whenever possible, reminding people of uncertainty and interdependence, right? That there is this remarkable possibility at all times that things will go wrong, or that we are missing something, or that that we will have predicted the future wrong. So because of that, the person whose voice kind of speaks sooner to notice something out of whack is like a hero, not a nuisance. So you're trying to reframe reality to be the kind of reality that speaker-uppers are heroes, not nuisance, right? Because our default mental model is that it's a nuisance. So that's really just calling attention to, like, ooh, we've never been here before, or the markets have never been more uncertain. You're saying things to let people know we don't have a crystal ball, need to hear from you. The during is, to me, just that simple art of asking good questions. It's just, as you're doing now, like, Amy, tell me about this, right? And I promise you, it would feel very awkward for me to sit quietly after you asked me a question, right? Everybody knows that. It's a compulsion to answer. If someone, especially being thoughtful and seeming genuinely interested, asks you a question, you will answer. Right. And so that helps. And then finally, it's the old bad news thing. How do you respond? Right. When people do speak up with a dissenting view, or with a report that a project's behind schedule, how do you respond? Right. Do you say, how the heck did that happen? Or do you say, thanks for that clear line of sight? Right. And the latter is a better response if you want to hear from people again.
So I was just thinking, and this touches on the article that we wrote as well, that perhaps historically managers and bosses or leaders saw that they were being rewarded for, being in a position of authority, knowledge, and
certainty.
At least, certainty, right? So there was an interpersonal cost or risk to them in confessing that they didn't know, right?
Right, exactly. And that's certainly true. Some of my early research was in healthcare delivery and hospitals. Really true in that context. It's much less so today, but where doctors were supposed to be all knowing, and they were incredibly reluctant to say, I don't know, or, even this could be, or I need to hear from you, I might miss something. But now I think that's become more commonplace. But you're right, it's a two-way street here, because our mental models of what employees are supposed to do their jobs and do them well, but managers are supposed to be all knowing, all seeing, have the answers. Neither one of those models works very well anymore, but we haven't given them up. And I think managers, but many leaders would like to be seen as, perfect, as having the answers, as compelled. That's where they get there, or that's where they think they get their legitimacy. But I think you and I in our writing have written, no, in fact, you get your legitimacy from your curiosity, from your ability to hypothesize and engage and empower people to help test those hypotheses.
So what makes someone a vulnerable leader, or what drives people to look at a boss or a manager and say, this is a great boss, a great manager, because I can see their vulnerability as a person? How did that become a positive trait in organizations?
Right. It sounds implausible, doesn't it?
Yes.
And yet I suspect that most listeners have had an experience, you hope they've had an experience of someone who did have, with a light in their eyes, they would say things like, wow, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. You'll follow them anywhere, right? Because first of all, they seem more honest. They seem passionate. They seem caring, right? So when you ask the question, what makes someone a vulnerable leader, there's almost a flip response, which is, it's just a fact, right? We're all vulnerable. right? We're all vulnerable to the vagaries of fate. We're all vulnerable to the unexpected things that can happen in markets and weather patterns and everything else. So we are, by definition, vulnerable. The only variable is, do we admit it, right? Do we own it? Do we own it and make it a strength rather than a weakness we're trying to hide?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I guess that is, by definition, a sort of a less hierarchical way or archetype to evaluate leaders' roles, right? Not as someone who is sort of the center of knowledge and authority and influence, but someone who actually enables people to produce their best and work together as a team.
Yeah, and maybe the right model, as I hear you say that, the model that pops into my mind is that of a principal investigator, a scientist in a lab, right? A scientist in a pretty, in a medium or big size lab is admired for her ability to drum up good questions, right? And the kinds of questions that can keep younger investigators busy for a while. And if they're interesting questions, the chances are that some of the hypotheses will fail, because by interesting, I mean kind of leading edge, new territory. So it's that maybe that ability to kind of see a possibility sooner than others, but still without certainty. And then help inspire others to get out there and test and execute on these things, right? That's what a good lab does. And I think that's what good organizations that face high uncertainty do as well.
Yeah. So it seems to me one of the issues, maybe endemic issues, might be that people with those qualities or characteristics are not naturally power hungry, and they don't want to be running a country or running a business. They want to be in an academic research lab working, right? So, how can we address that issue, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe the scientist is, in a sense, not an extreme, but on one end of the spectrum. But I think very good leaders, even in routine operating companies like automotive, act like that anyway, in a funny way. So think about Alan Mulally, and so much has been written about him, and there are many good videos you can find of him talking about how he turned Ford around a few years back, right? And you hear, there's a little bit of a sense of humor about it, but he'll say things like, hey team, we're on track to lose $17 billion this year. What isn't going well, right? To kind of try to get the good news. And then with enthusiasm, when he finally hears stuff, it's like, okay, how can we help, right? And then you start to see the team problem solving kick in, right? So it's that same, what he's modeling, and I think good leaders in every setting, Ken Frazier at Merck, others are modeling. The future is full possibility, but we don't actually know exactly how to, how to capture it yet, right? I need your help, right? And that's what the scientist does. That's what I think good leaders in business do. And yes, I agree, they're rare, right? They're rare because we aren't, we're over rewarding the behaviors. I mean, this is what you've written so much about, right? So if you think about a kind of a dimension of success, getting ahead, getting society's rewards, whatever that might mean, fame, money, that's one dimension. The other dimension is really having a positive impact on some, creating value for customers, society, whatever it is. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, but unfortunately they don't always go together. In fact, they so clearly don't always go together that you can readily create the 2x2 here. And the upper right-hand quadrant are what I think you and I would be enthusiastic about calling true leaders, right? They're making a positive difference, and they have generally gotten ahead enough to run something, right? But just because people can get ahead for all the wrong reasons doesn't mean they also can't get ahead for some of the for the right reasons.
And it seems that often, or too often in the West, we look at, let's say, the East or more kind of traditional hierarchical cultures and say, oh, you know, you want the powerful leader. But in the meantime, here we want superheroes that are, you know, like sort of
we want easy answers.
Exactly.
Right, cartoon, exactly. And we want easy answers. I mean, people just want, in a way, we are, you know, we're fundamentally lazy as a species, I guess. You know, we would prefer things to be easy than hard. And so if someone comes and promises you easy answers and they have a loud enough voice, or whatever, you are vulnerable to falling prey to the trap.
Yeah, and on the issue of, you know, safety as a kind of positive influence or muscle that teams and organizations can have. Obviously, when Google popularized your work and sort of a lot of people in the team effectiveness space started to highlight the virtues of safety to enhance team performance, you know, there's a lot of research on that, and you know, I think the evidence is very clear. But perhaps equally important, we also know that if you want to avoid toxic behaviors and bad behaviors such as bullying, harassment, etc., safety is critical as well, right? Can you speak a little bit to the importance of safety if organizations want to truly be more ethical and have a culture of integrity?
I think it's a really important question and connection, right? It's because of course there's a lot of interest, and rightly so, on cultures of ethics and integrity. And I suppose the word that we share, you know, if I'm primarily interested in psychological safety, and if others might be primarily interested in integrity and ethical behavior, the theme that links these two is transparency, right? In both domains, you want to know what's really going on, right? You don't want the facade, you don't want the fake. And in fact, in my book, Fearless Organization, some of the case studies that are in the negative camp are ethical violations, right? They're the VW Dieselgate scandal, right? I mean, essentially, it's a terrible ethical lapse to lie to regulators about what your engine is really emitting. You want to do it because you're making lots of money on that car, blah blah blah. But it's obviously ethically inappropriate. And the reason it didn't come out sooner, I mean, so many of these things come out eventually, but only after millions of dollars and health risks and everything else have gone, you know, been wasted and occurred, it eventually comes out. And what you would prefer in both my work and work on ethical culture, ethical behavior, is to know quickly, right? When there are transgressions, the sooner you know, the more quickly you can do something about it. So that transparency, that openness is just a crucial piece.
In the last article we wrote together, we also talk about the moral responsibility to show courage in people who are not in organizations that have safety and where they, you know, so what are your thoughts on that, and what are examples that come to mind where, you know, because it will be easy for people to say, well, I'm in this type of organization, so, you know, I can be a bystander, or the risk to speak up is too high or too problematic. And so what is the call to kind of display courage, or should people just give up and go somewhere else?
Right, you're absolutely right. And of course, I don't believe, and I know you don't either, that people should give up. That's why we're here. Like, we're here to make a difference. You got to keep fighting. And it's I'm glad you brought this up, because it's we can't ignore courage. And my friend Jim Dieter has written a great deal about courage, and including a great new book about it. But I tend to think of courage and psychological safety as two halves of the same really precious coin. And getting transparency, making a difference, having a positive impact, requires some courage, requires courage to take those risks. And when there's nothing sadder than, people saying, I'm seeing this bad behavior, but it's just not, there's not enough in it for me to bother reporting, right? I'll just leave, or I'll just lay low and, hope it goes away. And then thereby losing the chance to do something right that makes a difference. And in our recent article, we wrote about the story of Emmy Neutfeld at Google, was the victim of harassment by a terribly inadequate manager. And as she wrote about her own story, her conclusion was that people should just, it's just not worth it, right? It's not worth it to try to do anything because you get further hassle when you do. That broke my heart, right? I mean, my heart is broken by what she went through, but just as broken by the message she took away, which is, in a way, passing the buck or kicking the ball down the street for someone else to handle it, because it's not acceptable, right? And it's not, I don't give up, right? I mean, I don't believe that we can't keep doing better.
Mm-hmm. 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 That's a wonderful line. Do you think we don't have enough examples, especially living examples, of moral leadership? Like, why is it so difficult when you ask people, who would be a moral leader today, to have an answer that doesn't invite 500 angry responses or, sort of counter arguments to that?
No, it is. Well, first of all, it's always hard to hold anyone up as an exemplar of anything, right? Except maybe in sports. But it's maybe because, our thinking is too bimodal. Like you're either the perfect leader role model or you're a bum, right? And that's a kind of erroneous thinking. Like each and every one of us is a little bit of good and a little bit of bad, and we aspire to keep, I think the leaders, the good leaders, are the ones who are aspiring to keep doing better, that they're fully aware that they're fallible, right? They're fully aware that they're imperfect human beings, and that just means I'm going to wake up tomorrow and try to do better, right? Again and again and again. And so you're right. I mean, I can't tell you how many times when I'm trying to think of a role model, I'm thinking of Abraham Lincoln, or as you said, someone long dead and extraordinary, right? In their kind of self-awareness. So what we're looking for is self-awareness and kind of determination to keep being better. And better means less about me and more about us, right? I mean, in some ways it's that simple.
Do you have hope, having taught business school students for a while? Do you see a true change in values, goals, incentives, right? If we think about sort of, 80s, 90s now, what's the kind of transition? I mean, is it just lip service? Does it sound great to talk about inclusivity and ESG, or is there a true change in zeitgeist and in values?
I'm going to go with yes, without conviction, right? So I'm going to say yes, we see it, like we see evidence of it. We see young alumni and students starting companies that they believe will make a difference, carbon sequestration, green ag, whatever, the sustainability angle. We see people going into city government. We see more of that maybe certainly than we would have in the 80s and 90s. And all of this is taking place still in a culture, a broader culture that takes for granted money as the clearly highest motivator, right? That takes for granted money is everything, right? The rest is a sideshow, right? So you can have all of this conversation, but we have so deified money and wealth You can't pick up the newspaper without, some story about just, one of a handful of multi-billionaires, right? They are our celebrities. And so, as long as we have a single yardstick of what success looks like, even though we can sort of talk around the edges about other things, I think we still have this deep, nearly religious commitment to money as the yardstick. It gets us in trouble because it's a fake man-made yardstick, right? It has very little to do with the ecosystem in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, so if you say yes, but with a conviction, would you say that at least there are kind of other motives or values that have been added to the table, and that if today, as a young kind of MBA student, you say, well, my only goal is to kind of be rich and make money, it's at least
you might not say that, right? You're less willing to say. And the good news about that vertical dimension we were talking about before of sort of rewards is that status and recognition are also on that dimension, right? That that it's money is clearly on that dimension, but people can pursue, and I think it can be a win-win, recognition of their peers, of society, for doing good things, not just for doing well.
So I want to finish with a couple of more personal questions. The first is a question that I've been asking everyone who I've spoken to during this year and a half since I started doing this as a kind of pet lockdown project, which is to reflect on what they've learned about the world in these 16 months or so. So that's number one. What will be your reactions if you had to rate or grade humanity during these 16 months? What's your evaluation?
I'm not, this will not get points for originality, but I think the power of, the importance of relationships and relatedness has never been more clear to me. Maybe it was one of those things we took for granted. We took for granted the friends we had for dinner and the just getting out and doing things, and even nodding and smiling to people passing on the street, when you can't do that very well with a mask on. There was an emptiness, right? There was a kind of hollowness that we partially substituted for with Zoom meetings, not just work meetings, but you'd connect Zoom social events with friends. And I suppose the upside was I connected with people who are important friends in my life, but who normally I don't talk to very often because they live in New Mexico and I live in Boston. And when you find yourself, it's like, wait a minute, if I'm talking to the friends down the road by Zoom, I might as well talk to the friends, in another location. But there is a renewed appreciation for how important the people and the relationships we have, that I have, are versus all of the other activity that we have.
So just because we spend more time with our machines doesn't mean we love them more than humans.
No, it's touch and go.
Yeah. Hey, and the last one, I'm going to pull out another quote from your great book, and we're going to post to this, but it's sort of I would say is one of the Bibles of leadership, but I'm not really very fond of the Bible or very religious. So when I say that,
wrong word.
I mean it in the most academic of kind of praises and kudos. But there's in chapter 4, you have a great quote by Sidney Harris that goes like this: regret for the things we did can be tempered by time. It is regret for the things we did not do that is inconsolable. So what is your main regret? Having not done what? If you had to look back and say, oh well, applying this tenet to yourself, or this precept to yourself, what is the thing you wish you had done that you didn't do?
Oh gosh, that's too hard a question. and because it's inherently hard to think of, the dog that didn't bark. I mean, there is likely a very good answer to that question. This is not a very good answer to that question, but when I was younger, I was very good, meaning, right out of college, and very good at explaining complicated, math to kids and, high schoolers in a way that, the people, often young women, who would say, well, I can't do math. It's like it just hadn't been taught to them well. And for a while I had a kind of passion about this, right? That if and the importance of sort of quantitative and technical skill has only grown since that time, but that if only, when math is better explained, then it's fun, right? It's so the long-winded answer is, I could have done something about math literacy and friendliness, possibly. Like that could have been a field and a purpose, but I sort of lost the thread and went in another direction.
So maybe in another life you would have taught maths to young women, which you can obviously do still in your next career chapter.
That's right, and more than just a few. Like you could develop curricula or tools or things that made it more widely accessible. Now, of course, we've got Khan Academy now doing some of that important work.
Yep. Amy, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure. I am optimistic that the next one might be in person. I think we're approaching kind of that stage, but always great to chat. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas, and we'll share this with relevant links. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okie dokes.